The phone call was recorded at 11:47 p.m., and what Jennifer Gledhill said next would seal her fate forever.
On September 28th, Jennifer Gledhill called police to report her husband, Matthew Johnson, missing.
The disappearance of Matthew Johnson, a Utah father and husband, and the arrest of his wealthy wife, Jennifer Gledhill, for first-degree murder.
Jen in our home before and, breaking bread with them. And then it turned out that she's responsible for his death. It was shocking, frankly.
From the outside, this family looked untouchable. A decorated green beret, a $1 million home, 3 kids growing up in a quiet, upscale Utah neighborhood. So, how did it end with a man vanishing and a body that still hasn't been found? That's the question investigators, friends, and eventually an entire courtroom would be forced to confront. Matthew Johnson was the kind of man people trusted instinctively. A respected member of the Utah National Guard's elite Special Forces unit, he was known among fellow soldiers as steady, intelligent, and reliable. The guy you went to when you needed answers. Someone who stayed calm under pressure. Someone you believed would always come home. At home, Matthew and his wife, Jennifer Gledhill, appeared to be building a stable life. They were raising their children far from chaos, far from danger. To neighbors, nothing seemed off. No police visits, no public arguments, no visible cracks, just another successful family living the American dream. But appearances, as it turned out, were doing more work than anyone realized. Behind closed doors, the marriage was quietly eroding. By the summer of 2024, it had reached a breaking point. Court records would later describe a relationship marked by constant conflict and emotional volatility, arguments that didn't fade, only intensified. In August, Jennifer took a step that immediately changed the trajectory of everything. She filed for a temporary protective order against Matthew, telling the court she feared him. If granted, it would have forced them apart overnight, reshaping custody, finances, and the future of their family. But when the case reached a judge, the evidence didn't land the way anyone expected. Videos submitted in support of the request showed confrontation more than fear. Text messages revealed communication that was aggressive, demeaning, and mutual in its intensity. 2 people locked in a cycle neither seemed able to step out of. The judge dismissed the request, ruling there was no clear abuse. His written conclusion would later feel unsettling in hindsight. He described a marriage so dysfunctional it was bringing out the worst in both parties, adding that it should have ended long before it reached this point. At the time, it read like a harsh but ordinary assessment of a failing relationship. Nothing more. But outside the courtroom, something was shifting. In the weeks that followed, Matthew began confiding in close friends that things at home felt unstable, off in ways he couldn't quite explain. Some nights, he didn't sleep there at all. He told people he trusted that he needed distance, that he needed out. In one of his final conversations, Matthew admitted he'd reached a difficult conclusion. The marriage was over. He was preparing to move on. He never got the chance. Because while the court saw a collapsing marriage and friends saw a man planning his exit, something else was quietly taking shape behind the scenes. A secret that hadn't yet surfaced. One that would transform a bitter separation into a homicide investigation. What if the person sharing your bed wasn't just drifting away, but quietly building a life that made your absence necessary? While Matthew was confiding in friends about divorce and trying to figure out how to start over, investigators would later learn that Jennifer had been living a parallel reality. Hidden beneath the collapsing marriage was another relationship, one kept from friends, kept from family, and kept from the man she still shared a home with. According to court filings, this wasn't a brief distraction or a passing flirtation. It was intense, emotionally consuming, and increasingly central to Jennifer's daily life. The man involved believed he was getting to know someone navigating a difficult separation. not someone who would soon find herself at the center of a homicide investigation. As the weeks passed, those closest to Matthew began noticing changes. Friends later told police that he felt the situation at home had grown unpredictable. Some nights, he didn't sleep there at all. He spoke openly about needing distance, about the marriage being over, about starting fresh before things became worse. What he didn't know was how quickly events were accelerating. Just 2 days before Matthew was killed, Jennifer showed her lover a loaded Glock handgun she kept inside the home. At the time, it didn't seem alarming. In military households, firearms aren't unusual, but prosecutors would later point to that moment as significant, arguing it wasn't random, but part of a pattern that only became clear after the fact. Then came the night of September 20th. According to statements later given to investigators, Matthew discovered the affair. Witnesses would report hearing a heated argument coming from the home, raised voices, anger, years of resentment finally surfacing all at once. What happened after that argument has been examined repeatedly and debated ever since. What is not disputed is this. In the early hours of September 21st, Matthew Johnson was shot and killed inside his own home. Jennifer would later admit to pulling the trigger. How those final moments unfolded, what was said, what was felt, what was feared, remains contested. Prosecutors argue the shooting was deliberate and unprovoked. The defense would later describe a far more complex emotional and psychological state. But regardless of interpretation, the outcome was the same. Matthew Johnson was dead, and once that line was crossed, the story didn't slow down, it darkened. Because the hours that followed weren't marked by panic or a call for help. Investigators say they were marked by movement, decisions, and deliberate actions, steps that suggested not shock, but calculation. How do you go from sharing a life with someone to treating their body like evidence that needs to disappear? That question is at the center of this case because what happened in the early hours of September 21st is known only in fragments, statements, forensic findings, and the trail left behind afterward. According to statements Jennifer Gledhill later made to investigators, Matthew Johnson was shot inside their home sometime after the argument the night before. Prosecutors allege he was in the master bedroom when it happened, though no one else witnessed the exact sequence of moments leading up to the gunshot. What is not disputed is the outcome. Matthew Johnson was killed by a gunshot wound, and no call for help was ever made. Investigators say what followed is where the case took a darker turn. According to Jennifer's own account, she did not contact emergency services, family, or friends. Instead, she described a series of actions taken in the hours after Matthew's death, actions prosecutors would later characterize as deliberate. She told police that she placed Matthew's body into a rooftop storage container, moved it through the house, and loaded it into the family minivan. She admitted to destroying his phone, eliminating one of the fastest ways he could be tracked. She also said she drove Matthew's truck away from the home and left it parked in a nearby neighborhood, an action investigators believe was meant to create the impression that he had left on his own. Jennifer further told police that she then drove north with Matthew's body and buried him somewhere in Utah. That location has never been confirmed. Despite extensive searches, Matthew Johnson's remains have never been recovered. When Jennifer returned home, investigators believe an extensive cleanup followed. Officers later documented the strong smell of bleach throughout the house. They noted stains on walls and on the slats of the bed frame, as well as a large bloodstain beneath the bed that had soaked into the carpet. A new mattress had been ordered and delivered days later, replacing the one from the master bedroom. To prosecutors, this sequence suggested an attempt to erase what had happened, but the most consequential moment did not happen at the crime scene. Days later, Jennifer went to see the man she had been having an affair with. According to him, she confessed, describing the shooting, the disposal of Matthew's body, and the cleanup that followed. He later told police that when he noticed bruises on her body and asked about them, Jennifer said she got them while burying her husband and cleaning the house. That conversation changed everything. Realizing the gravity of what he had been told and fearing for his own safety, he began documenting their communications. Because what Jennifer would say next, in recorded calls, would strip away any remaining ambiguity. What would you do if the person sitting across from you calmly admitted they had killed their spouse and spoke about it as if it barely mattered? That is the position Jennifer Gledhill's lover later told police he found himself in. After her initial confession in person, he became increasingly unsettled, not just by what she said, but by how casually she said it. According to investigators, he decided to begin recording their phone conversations, sensing that what he knew was far more serious than he had first understood. In one of those recorded calls, when he told Jennifer that her confession frightened him, her response would later become a focal point for prosecutors. According to transcripts released in court filings, Jennifer is heard saying that Matthew wasn't a person anymore, adding that he wasn't mad. Investigators later pointed to that language as significant, not for its emotional impact, but for what it suggested about how Jennifer was framing Matthew's death. During the same conversation, when asked how she would feel if the situation were reversed, Jennifer responded, "Not if I deserved it." In another portion of the recordings, she spoke in broader terms about people she viewed as harmful or worthless, statements prosecutors would later characterize as deeply troubling given the context in which they were made. What stood out just as much as the words themselves was the timing. These conversations took place before Matthew Johnson was officially reported missing. Yet Jennifer consistently referred to him in the past tense. To investigators, that detail carried weight. It suggested knowledge that no one else outside the home yet had. Days passed before Jennifer contacted police, claiming Matthew had left voluntarily and told her not to reach out. By that point, the Utah National Guard had already begun asking questions after Matthew failed to report for duty. Meanwhile, the man who had recorded the calls began preserving everything: screenshots of text messages, audio recordings, and timelines, before ultimately going to police. When investigators executed a search warrant at the home, the physical evidence began aligning with what had been described in the recordings. Officers documented bloodstains beneath the bed, marks on the bed frame and walls, and a strong odor of cleaning chemicals throughout the house. They also confirmed the recent purchase and delivery of a new mattress. Phone records and GPS data traced Jennifer's movements during the critical hours, mapping onto locations investigators were already scrutinizing. At that point, the case shifted. This was no longer a missing person investigation shaped by conflicting stories. It was a homicide investigation supported by recorded admissions and physical evidence. On October 2nd, armed with those recordings and corroborating forensic findings, police arrested Jennifer Gledhill on charges including first-degree murder and obstruction of justice, but the investigation didn't end with her arrest because as detectives continued piecing together what happened after Matthew's death, evidence suggested the aftermath involved more than one set of hands. How far would parents go to protect their child? Not in theory, but when investigators believe evidence is being destroyed in real time. That question only began to surface after Jennifer Gledhill's arrest, when the timeline stopped pointing to a single person and started widening outward. In the days following Matthew Johnson's disappearance, Jennifer's parents told police they had briefly stopped by her home to pick up clothing for the children. At the time, it sounded routine, but as investigators reconstructed those days, phone data and location records suggested something different. According to court filings, the couple spent several hours inside the house during a window when evidence was being cleaned and removed. As follow-up interviews continued, additional details raised red flags. Records showed that Jennifer's mother purchased the replacement mattress that arrived shortly after Matthew's death, replacing the one from the master bedroom. Around the same time, investigators discovered her phone had been remotely reset, erasing location and activity data from the very days under scrutiny. Physical evidence removed, digital evidence erased. Then came a moment detectives couldn't ignore. During a later interview, Jennifer's father referenced where the incident happened. Language investigators found notable because the existence of a crime scene had not yet been publicly disclosed. To them, it suggested knowledge that extended beyond what had been shared. As the scope of the case expanded, police executed a search warrant at the parents' residence. Among the items recovered was a firearm box matching the model of a Glock handgun Jennifer had previously shown to her lover, according to court filings. The box was found inside a plastic container wrapped in a child's garment and stored near Jennifer's former bedroom. Investigators did not allege that Jennifer's parents were present during the killing itself, but prosecutors would later argue that their actions afterward crossed a legal line. Both parents were arrested and charged with obstruction of justice. While those legal proceedings unfolded, the search for Matthew intensified. Law enforcement agencies, volunteers, and members of Matthew's own military unit organized searches across multiple counties in northern Utah. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Friends and fellow Green Berets later described the uncertainty as unbearable. The idea that one of their own was still missing, still unrecovered, weighing heavily on them. During court hearings, prosecutors revealed that a rooftop-style storage container had been recovered from a body of water and contained Matthew's blood. Investigators have not publicly confirmed whether it was the same container Jennifer referenced in her confession, but they described the finding as consistent with earlier statements and forensic evidence. Even so, as the case moved toward trial, attention began shifting away from what happened and toward why. Prosecutors outlined a motive rooted in collapse and consequence, an affair, a looming divorce, shared custody of 3 children, financial fallout, and a life insurance policy worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. With Jennifer pleading not guilty, the question facing the jury was no longer just how Matthew Johnson disappeared, but what someone stood to gain by making sure he never came back. Why choose murder over divorce? That is the question prosecutors have built this case around, and they argue the answer is disturbingly simple. According to court filings, Jennifer Gledhill didn't want separation. She wanted control over what came next. Control over custody. Control over finances. Control over a future that had already begun slipping away. In the prosecution's view, divorce meant consequences Jennifer was no longer willing to accept. Shared parenting, court oversight, financial obligations, and a life where decisions were no longer hers alone. Matthew Johnson wasn't just a husband she wanted to leave. He represented complications she couldn't erase through legal separation. Murder, they argue, removed every one of them in a single irreversible act. As the case moved forward, another detail added weight to that theory. Matthew carried a life insurance policy valued at roughly $500,000, with Jennifer named as the beneficiary. With Matthew dead and Jennifer charged with his murder, that money remains frozen in court. Its fate undecided. Prosecutors have not argued that money alone was the motive. Instead, they have presented it as part of a larger convergence where financial, security, custody, and personal freedom collided at the worst possible moment. Jennifer has pleaded not guilty to all charges and remains in custody, denied bail after prosecutors argued she posed an ongoing risk and had expressed a willingness to harm herself rather than face prison. Her trial is scheduled for late 2025, where a jury will be asked to decide a central question. Was this a crime born of sudden emotion or one shaped by intent and preparation? But while the legal process moves forward, one reality remains unchanged. Matthew Johnson is still missing. His body has not been recovered. His family has not been able to bring him home or lay him to rest. Friends who served beside him, men trained to endure the unimaginable, have spoken openly about how the uncertainty follows them into sleepless nights. Matthew was more than a name in court filings. He was a father who showed up, a soldier others relied on, a man who believed he still had time to untangle a failing marriage and build something better on the other side. Instead, prosecutors say his life ended quietly without warning, and his body was hidden somewhere no one has yet found. 3 children have been left to grow up without answers, carrying a loss that doesn't even have a place to visit. And that may be the most unsettling part of this case. Not just that a marriage ended in violence, but that one person's desire to start over erased another person entirely. Somewhere in northern Utah, Matthew Johnson is still waiting to be found. And until that happens, this story doesn't really end. It just remains open. So, if you liked the story and want to hear more stories like that, then hit the subscribe button and like the video. See you in another video with another story. Till then, peace out.